Welcome to the webinar for February. This month we're going to be talking about accommodations in the workplace based on essential duties. So my name is Sarah Snabel and I'll be the presenter today. I have done a couple of different projects based on essential duties. It seems to be a fairly hot topic right now. I actually did a presentation last month in January at the HRPA National Conference on a very similar topic to this, kind of based on a project that I did with the city of Mississauga in 2013 and 2014. It was an ongoing project. And so what I decided to do is kind of take a spin on that and talk about how we can do accommodations in the workplace, really focusing on essential duties. So what I want to do, what I'll start with actually is just to give you a little bit of a rundown on this new webinar platform that we're using. So we're using GoToWebinar now. And if you've been to our webinars in the past, we've used AnyMeeting. So there should be some kind of perks to using this one instead. Hopefully it's a little bit of a smoother viewing perspective for you all in terms of no ads or distractions along the side. And other than that, it should be a very similar format that you can use the chat bar and you can type in your questions. All questions that you type in will be anonymous to other viewers. You can choose to share your name if you want, but the presenters and organizers will see your question, will see who it's coming from, and will be able to respond. So we can either read the question out loud or we can type a response as well. I will be recording the webinar, so for anybody who misses a little bit of it, or if you wanted to review it, I'll make sure to send out the recording afterwards. So just to kind of answer some of those general questions up front. I'll do my best to answer questions as we go through. Again, something else that's a little bit different with this webinar software is that the audio is a little bit different. So, I mean, hopefully you can hear through your speakers. And if you can't hear through your speakers, then there should be a local, well, relatively local, depending where you're calling from. But there's a Toronto number actually that you can call in. So if you should be able to click that option to connect via your telephone. And if you're having trouble with that, you might want to try. I can see somebody has sent me a question saying that they're having trouble entering with the access code. So what I might suggest is just going to our website and try to re-register for the webinar, and then you'll be able to join the webinar in progress. And hopefully what it'll do is it'll actually send you, it'll send you an automatic login information. So that might help to get you connected during this webinar. Okay, so housekeeping stuff aside, let's talk a little bit about PROergonomics just to make sure that everybody, I just need to make sure that you guys can all see my screen here. Okay, there we go. Great. So agenda for today. I wanted to give a little bit of background information, kind of where this term essential duty comes from, and talk a little bit about the AODA. I feel like that's part of the history when we talk about essential duty, and kind of one of the things that I'm seeing, we get a lot of questions about this, and it's because of the AODA, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, because that's been something new in the forefront of employers for them having to comply, that we're getting a lot of questions on, how am I in compliance and what do I need to do, and what is an essential duty, and what's going to happen if I get challenged, or how do I know I'm in compliance? I really want to make sure that I'm doing it right. So let me just talk. I'm going to start with talking a little bit about that legislative background, just to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page as to why we talk about essential duties, and then we'll go through actually defining what is an essential duty and kind of some of the pros and cons. So why would you identify the essential duties of a job, and how or when would you identify them, and some of the benefits of identifying them. And as I go through, I'll kind of give some examples about some different clients that we've worked with in terms of how they've chosen to identify essential duties. There's not always, one document that's going to be this perfect document for every single company out there. In some cases, you might have a job description. Some cases, you might use a physical demands assessment. In some cases, you might have, another custom document. For the city of Mississauga, we created an essential duties worksheet, and that was their kind of base document. So in many cases, there might be some different documents to use, but that's the whole goal of today's webinar, is to really talk about what is an essential duty, how are you defining it or documenting it, and making sure that we are trying to be consistent. So again, talking about that legislative background, I mean, this all stems from the Ontario Human Rights Code. That is really the base, the foundation of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And it's not necessarily that the AODA is brand new information or that it's replacing the Human Rights Code for that matter. This is more so that it is building on it, and it's got more of a focus on disabilities. So the Human Rights Code, it's the foundations of the human resources profession, really. And I mean, the main thing to take from that, if we want to just pick one small little piece that kind of summarizes the Human Rights Code, it's freedom from discrimination. So the Human Rights Code, that's the goal. Freedom from discrimination, whether it be disability, whether it be gender, whether it be family status, the list goes on. And then the AODA, the Ontarians with Disabilities Act, sorry, that's not the AODA, just the ODA, that came along in 2001. And it was a good start, but what they really wanted to do in 2005 with this AODA is really a strong focus on disabilities. So the purpose is really to improve opportunities for people with disabilities and to make sure that they had equal opportunity. So it's not just in every aspect, right? So they've come up with these different, stemmed into the integrated accessibility standards. So in there's several different standards. There's employment standard, there's customer service, there's transportation, the built environment. So really trying to look at making Ontario as a whole freedom from barriers, right? So that's kind of the background about how all of these documents connect. Really, the Ontarians with Disabilities Act, the AODA, the accessibility standards, all of those are building on the Ontario Human Rights Code. They're not meant to replace it. So again, the Human Rights Code, again, that's including disability. It includes the employment application process, full-time, part-time work. I'm trying to focus specifically on how it applies to the workplace. So that will be the focus of today's webinar, is really how it applies to the workplace. So I'm not necessarily thinking, when we go to the store and all of those aspects. I'm talking more from an employment perspective, so how you're going to accommodate an employee, for example. And really what you can pull from the Human Rights Code is that your ideal candidate or your employee must be able to perform the essential duties of the job with or without reasonable accommodations. And that's really where that term essential duties comes from. It comes from the Human Rights Code, right? So that you need to know what the essential duties of your job is. So what are those bona fide occupational requirements? And your employee or your ideal candidate should be able to do those with or without reasonable accommodations. And I know that's kind of a loaded description for many of you, but that's really what we're trying to focus on here. So really it means that anytime we're doing interview process, anytime we are doing any kind of testing in the interview process, when we are doing accommodation, so if somebody has been injured at work or if they're coming into the workplace, that we are making sure that we are accommodating them up to the point of undue hardship. Again, another loaded term. But if we talk about more like how the AODA fits into this, so it's got the more specific measures to help ensure an accessible Ontario by 2025 is really their goal, right? So they want to have a fully accessible Ontario, and really it's trying to make sure that we are it's like that, it's the how-to, right? So the AODA is kind of the outline, and then we have the IASR, the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulations, and there are 5 of those. There are 5 kind of separate documents that all flow together, and really these are the how-to or the building blocks. So you've got customer service, which I think most people are super familiar with. That's the stuff that you see, like the fact that there has to be ramps to get into buildings and stores and office buildings, or the buttons to open the doors. Those are some examples. Transportation, so how it relates to buses, how it relates to traveling from one place to the next. employment. That's definitely the aspect that we are focusing on today when we're talking about essential duties and accommodations in the workplace. Information and communication standard is about how we make information accessible to the public, to our employees. And the built environment are some standards related to design. So like the design of a physical building, or to ramps or parking lots, for example, in at stores, at retail buildings, at parks, anywhere out in the public. So those are kind of the main building blocks of the AODA. And the focus, again, as I mentioned today, the focus is on the employment standard. So how does this affect you? I mean, really, it applies to all employers in Ontario, all employees in Ontario. And really, when we're talking about, again, I'm talking about how does the AODA affect you from that employment standard perspective. It's that you have to have policies, practices, and procedures that support accessibility at your workplace. So usually that involves some training, having some policies in place, making sure that you are advertising that you will make accommodations for employees who request them if they need them. And there's milestones every 5 years. So there are some different compliance deadlines. And the deadlines vary a little bit versus, like if you're public versus private sector and the size of the company, usually it's about a cutoff. I mean, if you're a small private sector company of more than 50 people versus a large private sector company which would have more than 50 employees. That's usually the kind of guideline. And I don't have those specific compliance deadlines here or the cutoff criteria, but I mean, you can definitely find that online, and I'm happy to send you some links or references for that as well. But I mean, the whole goal is that really about 15% of the population has a disability, and this number is going to continue to grow. You know, we hear a lot, and we know that it's happening, that we have an aging workforce, that we have an aging population, and so the number of disabilities in Ontario, it's suspected to grow. So I really think that that's part of the reason why the government has tried to make this fully accessible Ontario by 2025 goal. They're trying to look to the future and be proactive. So all around, it's a good thing. But again, what I'm trying to help highlight today is that it's not something that we need to necessarily stress out about. There are lots of things about the AODA that are building on what you should already have in place. If you're in compliance with the Ontario Human Rights Code, you're not going to be so drastically out of compliance with AODA. There might be some small little tweaks that you might need to do to your policies, procedures, or programs, but as long as you are in compliance with the Ontario Human Rights Code, it's not like you have a ton of extra that you're going to need to add on. So focusing specifically on the employment standard, it's really trying to make the act of employment accessible. So finding, hiring, supporting, communicating with employees. It's to paid employment. And again, like I've mentioned, it's building on existing requirements. So it shouldn't necessarily be creating brand new things. More so, you might be actually just tweaking some of your things and kind of, dotting all your I's, crossing all your T's. So let's talk specifically about that term, essential duty, and making sure that we're all on the same page about what it really means. So an essential duty is a bona fide occupational requirement. And there are three kind of, tests, I guess, that you could say to do to really make sure that it is an essential duty. So the reason the position exists is to perform this function. So if you took that function away, it would fundamentally change the position. So, a customer service agent, for example, their job is to answer incoming calls, direct the calls as needed. So if you took away that function, if you took away the actual function of answering the phone calls, then yes, that would fundamentally change the position. So in that case, we could easily justify that a customer service agent or customer service representative, an essential duty is to answer incoming calls. It also could mean that the person has expertise to perform the duty. So it could be that they have a specific like license or a designation. So maybe they're a certified professional accountant. Maybe they are like a professional engineer. Maybe they have some kind of designation that's required for sign off or something related to the job. And then the third one that's a bit more general is that there's a bona fide or a reasonable connection to the requirements of the job. So, you're able to justify why you've thought that this is an essential duty, doing this task. I mean, and really, for a task to be considered an essential duty, it has to meet at least one of these criteria. It doesn't always have to meet all three, but it should meet at least one, a minimum of one. And I mean, even the Supreme Court of Canada has kind of a three-step test that they stick by to really determine if something is a bona fide occupational requirement. So it's something that you need to be able to establish that you really truly did think that it was an essential duty. So that process is trying to establish that rational connection. So for example, if we think about customer service, for example, the customer service representative, then potentially the employer said that, they believed that a good customer service would mean that you stand and greet your customers, right? If it's a face-to-face environment, for example. And although maybe standing to greet the customers was a measure of good faith, like they really thought that there was good intention, and that maybe they didn't even believe that really that was discriminating, it does have some discriminatory impact. For example, think of somebody who is in a wheelchair. So does that standard of having to stand to greet your customers, is that reasonable? So ultimately, no, you could easily argue that good customer service doesn't solely rely on standing to greet the customers, that there are lots of ways that you can present good customer service. So that's the first test, is trying to establish a rational connection. The second step is to establish good faith, so that you really need to be able to prove that, or kind of back up that you adopted that standard. You said that that was an essential duty of the job with good faith, with good intention, that you didn't mean for it to be discriminatory. You had no intention of that. It just, that's the way that it's been. And you need to be able to establish the good faith. And these are kind of very broad tests, I realize, in terms of doing these tests from the Supreme Court. And the third one is to establish a reasonable necessity. So what you want to do is it reasonably necessary for that? So I'm just trying to think of an example here. So you want to consider all reasons for accommodation. So in this case, if you're trying to establish a reasonable necessity, you've looked at all of the different options for accommodation. You're trying to say that, what, yeah, that totally is required. Maybe it's wearing a certain type of PPE, for example. I mean, really what you're trying to do with an essential duty is you want to be able to justify why you think that all of your employees need to do it that way, with that tool, in that manner. And so something that becomes really important when we're talking about, as much as we know what an essential duty is, now we want to be able to document it. And the number one thing to really make sure here is that you are consistent. There are lots of ways that you can identify it, and you want to make sure that you're consistent across the board. So how do we really know what they are? So we know the definition of an essential duty, and they can be kind of broad and generic in terms of trying to do these tests or these trying to answer these questions. So how do we really know what the essential duties of our jobs are? And what I might suggest is that you kind of take a look at some of the documents that you already have in your workplace. And that could be, for many of you, that's going to be different places, right? And you might call them something different than what I've got listed here. So if you're trying to look at what the demands of a job are, there are several places that you might be looking. So maybe you're looking at a job description. That might be a really good place to start. Maybe you're looking at a job posting. Maybe a job posting and a job description go hand in hand. Maybe they are a synonymous document. Maybe they are different in your workplace. Maybe you're looking at a job evaluation. And I know that those are called different things in different workplaces, but basically it's like usually they're used as a detailed evaluation to determine appropriate pay bands that a job might be classified in. Maybe you're also looking at a performance management plan. Maybe that's also documenting what some of the job demands are. And possibly if you've got if you've got jobs where you've got physical demands assessments or cognitive demands assessments, maybe even calling them job demands assessments, those might be all documents that you might look to that are documenting the demands of the job. Now, what's interesting about this is that uh, you could use all of these. All of these would be good, and it kind of depends on, this is where it really depends on your workplace, and I can't always answer this question for you other than to provide some guidance, is that you want to make sure that these documents are consistent and that they don't differ. The content doesn't differ dramatically. So if you're trying to document what is an essential duty, then what your job description says is required to do the job, and what your performance management plan says, and what your PDA says, they should all be speaking the same language. They shouldn't be saying something different. And what you'll find, and I mean, this is kind of speaking back to my project that I did with the city of Mississauga, is that they have thousands of jobs. There's lots of jobs at the city, and it's a big environment. And so what they were finding is that they just weren't having, there wasn't a consistent uh, document that was available for every job. So some jobs had job descriptions, but not all jobs did. Some jobs had PDAs, they had PDAs for, but not all did. Some jobs had a job evaluation, but not all of them. So there was always like a different selection of documents to choose from when they were looking at all of their different jobs. And so in their case, for that project in particular, we were trying to come up with one standardized document that, you know what, we want to know what the essential duties are. Which document are we going to go to? What is going to be our standard document that, we will use to defend ourselves if we're ever challenged? When we're talking about, yes, we're in compliance with the AODA, even if we were to get challenged from the Human Rights Tribunal, what document is it that we're going to use as our due diligence to say that we are confident that these are the essential duties? And so that was kind of the base question in the project that I worked on with them. And really, I think that that's kind of the guiding question that you need to be asking yourself right now. If you're looking at, okay, what are the essential duties in my workplace? You need to look at what documents you do have available. And, is there anything that's standardized? Do all of your job descriptions look the same? Do they follow the same format? Do all your job postings look the same, and do they follow the same format? And making sure that you really do have all of that necessary content in there. And in some cases, it might be that you've got the physical demands documented, or that you've got the education and the skills and knowledge background that's documented. You want to make sure that it is, again, consistent across the board. Even if you're going to choose to use 2 or 3 documents, okay, we want to know what the essential duties are. We are going to rely on our job description and our PDA. And you really want to make sure that they are speaking the same language. So that's your first step, really, is that you need to look at the documents that you have in place at your workplace and then decide which one you're going to use. 1, 2, whatever it might be. But again, double checking that you've got some consistency. And really, let's talk a little bit too about why we want to make sure that we are looking for these standardized documents. Like when I was working at the city of Mississauga, we had to really sit and think about these questions and really figure out how we were going to consistently identify those essential duties. And really the best practice is that instead of waiting for you to get tested or to get challenged through a human rights claim or from non-compliance from the AODA, the best practice really is to try and identify those job requirements or those essential duties up front. And that way then that you can be confident that you're not having a discriminatory impact, right? That that you have determined that these are the duties of the job and that you've got some reasonable connection or basis behind them. And so that's kind of why we want to do it, right? Is that we want to be in compliance, but also we want to be doing the right thing as well. We don't want to be discriminatory. And so really what are the potential implications if it's not identified? Well, in that case, the answer could be a couple of different things here, right? One is that, yeah, you might get challenged. You might get, and there might be an allegation against you for non-compliance with AODA, or you could get a human rights claim against you, right? Those are some of the obvious implications. The other thing too is even just the time that it takes. So let's say there's a potential claim coming your way, or somebody asks a question about, is this an essential duty, or can you accommodate me? is driving really requirement of this job, or will I be able to do the job even though, like if I need a TTY phone, for example? Like those are the questions that you need to be able to answer. And sometimes it can even just be as simple as the implication being wasted time, that you're not able to efficiently answer that question. And so then, you get a call, you've got to call like 2 or 3 of your colleagues to kind of make sure that you're all on the same page with how to answer that question. So having that standard document or documents that identify your essential duties makes it a lot more efficient to answer the questions, can be a lot more a bigger time saver, and even just help with the confidence, right? That you can be confident in how you're answering those questions. The best practice for identifying essential duties, this is the loaded question, right? And best practice is really that you're identifying them up front and that you're identifying them in a consistent way. And how each company does that might be a little bit different. So one thing that seems to be an obvious route is to use a job description. So if you have job descriptions in place, that's great. That might be the document that you want to use. And maybe what you want to do is look at your job descriptions and make sure that they have all of the information in there that really helps you to answer those questions about whether or not it's an essential duty, right? So you want to know the skills or the designations, the licenses, that expertise that might be required. And you also want to know some of the main tasks. So again, you're listing your customer service requirements. You're listing all of the main duties of the job. And ideally, you're listing some of the time that's required to do each of those, or the percentage weighting of each of those tasks. So I mean, best practice for identifying them is definitely having them documented. And then in terms of what that document is called, that's a bit more of where you get to customize. So for example, a job description is a great place. And I know at the City of Mississauga, what we chose to do was create a worksheet. They called it an essential duties worksheet. So it became the foundation that when they were creating a job description or a job posting or a PDA, that they would have this worksheet that would kind of go through almost like a chart style, and questions to really help probe them on what expertise is required to do this task, what equipment is required to do this task, do they have to drive a vehicle to do this task, do they have to sit or stand, what are the physical requirements to do this task, and we would break that down by each task. So it was very much of a detailed process. So if you are, again, looking at all of the different documents that you have in place, a job description might be one of the best places to start. Now, I know that most places probably have job descriptions, and so I really think that that probably is one of your best source documents. And really, it'll probably have already several components that you need. So if you're looking for what are the essential duties, this might be your really good starting point. Usually, it has a summary of the position. In some cases, it has a list of job duties, and depending on the quality of this list of job duties, you might be able to just use that as the essential duties, right? They might be detailed enough that it's actually, those are the tasks that you can use. And maybe you want to break them down a little bit more. Like maybe you actually want to list beside each of those tasks. Maybe there's 10 tasks listed there. Maybe if you break it down even by saying, like adding in something like a percentage, that this is 30% of the job or 50% of the job, right? It helps to give a bit of a weighting. It's important to note, though, actually, I should say that as a side note, that is that, like, let's say something is only 5% of the job, right? They only do it once a year. It takes a couple of days at a time. It's not to say that that's not an essential duty. It's hard to base an essential duty based on the amount of time that you do it, because it's still a requirement. I mean, an example that you can read in the Human Rights Code, they have some different guidelines, but they'll say, for example, if you're looking at a pilot, an essential duty is to, like the steps would be take off, fly the plane, land the plane. The actual amount of time that's spent doing takeoff and landing is really minimal in comparison to flying the plane. However, it's still essential. So that's just like a nice kind of obvious example to use that really helps to show how time isn't necessarily a good judgment of whether or not something is essential. Your job descriptions will likely also have education requirements or the designations, the licenses. Maybe you need to have 3 to 5 years experience doing building inspections. To be a building inspector, you have to have attended or received a degree or a diploma in a specific program. That different type of experience. Like often a job description will have that information as well, and then the general overview of the working conditions. So, some travel required or must travel within the GTA, or works from a home office versus works primarily from our main corporate office, must be here the hours of 9 to 5, those types of things. So again, you're kind of going to look at your your job description, and then really try to focus in on, does it really give you the answers that you're looking for? Do you think that you could confidently use that? And then you also want to think about some of the jobs that you have. So I'm just going to pause here for a moment because I see that there's a couple of questions that have come in. Great. Okay, so some questions that have come in have just been related to the sound, the audio. Sounds like people who were having challenges earlier got connected, so that's great. I'm going to continue on. So another document that, and this is going to kind of depend on the types of jobs that you have. So for example, some of your more administrative jobs, or maybe administrative is not really the right word, but your jobs that are more like desk jobs or office jobs, the job description might be the only document that you need, right? Because it's obvious that they work at a computer all day. But if you're finding that you've got a lot more jobs that are a bit more hands-on or a little bit more with more of a physical demand behind them, and those are the type of accommodations you're going to have to do. If you're doing an accommodation for somebody who's working in an office, let's say, for example, they need to have a lower desk because they sit in a wheelchair. Okay, that's a relatively easy accommodation. I'll say quote unquote easy, just because you'd be hard pressed to say that that's undue hardship, that you couldn't provide a desk that was low enough. Or if somebody was unable to sit because of a certain condition, then we could provide them with a standing workstation, right? So typically, or maybe they need screen reading software or dictation software. Usually working in an office environment, having a physical demands assessment is a little less important, or a little less necessary. But if you have a lot more physical jobs, then having a physical demands assessment or a job demands assessment might be the route that you want to go to really look at the detailed physical requirements of a job. And the nice thing about those is that it's objective, right? So it's including a lot of measurements. It's including what is required to do the job, looking at all of the different task steps. It quantifies how much time is spent doing each of those different tasks and the different postures that are required. So it can be a really good tool to use, more so to look at that physical aspect of the job. And in some cases, you can actually include a cognitive aspect as well. Like you'd have a cognitive demands assessment, and then often if you see them combined, if you see like a physical component and a cognitive component, they'll be called a job demands assessment, and that's the term that we use anyways at PROergonomics. But really, like when it comes to how we do physical demands assessments in particular, is that we really, on our cover page, we will highlight the essential duties. So we watch the person do the job. We look at any other documentation that you might already have available, and we would be documenting what is required from a physical perspective: the mobility, the strength, dexterity. If we were looking at cognitive demands, it would be about their decision-making responsibilities, whether or not they multitask, relationships, if they're exposed to confrontational situations and how they would be expected to resolve them, if they work independently versus teamwork, those kinds of things. So again, if you were talking about like a standardized document for your entire workplace, this might be another document, especially if you have a lot of physical jobs, that might be extremely complementary to your job description. So when you're talking about what are my standardized documents that I'm going to use to identify my essential duties, if you've got jobs that have a lot of physical demands to them, then having a job demands assessment or a physical demands assessment is going to be a really nice document to have. And if you're thinking about, okay, well, we already have some in place, or we have some, and how do I know if they're documenting the right things? A couple of things just to kind of do a check on is that really you should have something in there that documents the duties of the job, right? Like there should be some kind of a summary that says, Here are the tasks of the job, and then it should be breaking down what's physically required to do each of those. It should be objective, so that means that there needs to be measurements. It needs to be that it hasn't evaluated necessarily just one employee and how they're doing it. That's why you include the measurements to really make it objective. It should be concise, and that can mean a couple different things, like not necessarily that it's short, but that it is not super wordy. Right, so that's where the measurements come in handy. The more wordy it becomes, the more you've got long paragraphs, for example, the more it becomes open to interpretation and it introduces the subjectivity. I think it's important to have pictures. Again, that helps to give a description, right? Pictures say 1,000 words. And then really there's lots of ways that it's helping. Like one, it's helping us to identify what our essential duties are, which comes into talking about whether or not we're in compliance with the AODA from that employment standard. If we want to say that our employees or our ideal candidate has to be able to perform the essential duties of the position with or without reasonable accommodation, a job demands assessment is going to highlight the physical requirements of the job, and it will, help to outline to you or highlight some of the tasks or duties that might be outside of the person's capabilities. And then you can look at whether or not those can be accommodated. You can also use it for other things like WSIB claims, pre-screening initiatives, helping as a precursor of identifying some of your hazards if you're trying to incorporate them into your health and safety program. So there are some benefits, but I want to focus mostly on how it's helping you to identify your essential duties. So when we're talking about workplace accommodations, now this form that I've got shown here, your functional abilities form, this is more talking about somebody who is already an employee who has now become injured or a disability has been introduced, and now you're looking about whether or not they can do their pre-injury job. But something similar, this process in general would still be the same similar thought process anyways about how you would accommodate potentially a candidate. You do have different obligations to a candidate as opposed to an employee. You definitely have greater obligations to accommodate an employee as opposed to if you're just hiring somebody. But the ideal, like the kind of steps really, is that you're looking at what's physically required to do the job, and then you're looking at what the documented abilities are, and then trying to accommodate as necessary. And so again, when we're talking about what are the essential duties of the job, like that's really what we're supposed to be accommodating on. And so a physical demands assessment or the job demands assessment, or potentially your job description has a small section in there. Maybe you don't have a separate job demands assessment form. Maybe you have a small little chart. I know I've talked with some clients and that's what they've done, is that they have just a small piece within their job description that talks about the things that they have to lift and how often. Like I see that done in libraries, for example. So we have to move book trucks. This position requires moving book trucks and handling books and bins of books, and these are the weights and these are the forces. And so instead of having it in a separate form, they almost have it combined within their job description. So again, whatever works for your facility, as long as you've got again, dotting all your I's, crossing all your T's, making sure that you can confidently answer those questions. So for example, when it comes to doing a return to work plan or doing this job matching, you again want to have something that's documented, and so having that standardized document in place is going to help you with that accommodation piece. And here's kind of the flow. Really, so I mean, this again is talking about your worker is injured, and so I'm talking about this more so from accommodating somebody who's already working in your workplace. So the worker is injured, you're going to take a look at the case. Potentially they're coming at you with a functional abilities form, and then if you do have a PDA or a CDA, or you have your job description that has your list of duties in it and some of the physical requirements, you're going to be able to do a comparison, and it's going to be objective because you're looking at what's recorded on paper. So you're helping to reduce any bias, eliminate that bias, take out some of the subjectivity, and say, you know what, we've documented what's required. We're using this document. We use it for every case like this, and we're looking at what the worker is able to do, and then we're able to make that objective comparison. So is the worker able to meet the essential duties of the job as documented in our PDA, as documented in our job description, as documented in whatever we have said is our standardized document? If it's yes, great, worker comes back to the job. And if it's no, then we need to look at doing an accommodation or a modification. And that's where it becomes a little bit more custom because every disability is going to be different. So it's not just to say, okay, this person's in a wheelchair, therefore they automatically get accommodation A, right? We do need to talk and make sure that whatever that accommodation is going to be, whatever it is, that it's actually going to work for that employee. So that's where we come up with a return to work plan. And actually that's part of the employment standard as well. One of the elements is having a documented return to work plan, and that it's individualized so that it's custom for that employee, and that, again, importantly, that it's documented. So when we're talking about the employment standard and making sure that we're doing accommodations based on essential duties, having that standard document that you can confidently use to say these are the duties of the job, it's going to help you in several aspects of that employment standard within the AODA, as well as just helping to make sure that you've got, a nice clean process, and an efficient process when it comes to return to work. Like, you might already have a return to work plan in place, and that's great. Maybe it's just kind of looking at that, taking elements from that process, and maybe it's your return to work process or program that actually is going to help you the most in identifying your essential duties. Maybe that's where you look. So again, for each employer, that's going to be a little bit different. And then what you'll find is that, now I've put PDA, CDA in the middle here, but that might also be your job description. It's whatever document, really, in that center red circle. I want you to think about whatever document you have now selected as being able to identify the essential duties of your position, of your jobs. So maybe it's a job description, maybe it's the PDA, but as an example, a PDA, it's going to feed so many other aspects. I mean, as much as it's going to help with complying with the AODA and making sure that we can efficiently and confidently answer these questions, it's probably going to help to actually feed other things. So because it's an objective measurement of the demands of the job, right? It's got measurements, we've looked at several different employees doing the position. It can actually help feed all different aspects of even the hiring process, right? So helping us to develop our interview questions and the interview matrix, like how we score things. So, if it's required that doing presentations, for example, is that we really need this employee to be able to do public speaking, then maybe it helps us to guide how many questions we ask about their experience when it comes to doing presentations. Or maybe we actually develop a test in the interview process that they actually have to deliver a presentation to us, and that helps us with our scoring system. And then it can feed your job description, it can feed your health and safety program, any risk assessments that you might do. It can feed your job posting. So again, a job posting really should only be on what the essential duties are, right? I mean, you want to be posting on this is what's required to do the job, and no more than that, right? It shouldn't be kind of a phony or an elaborated description. It's going to help feed your performance management, and it's going to help with that long-term disability accommodation, short-term accommodation. It's going to help with your return to work program as well. So the nice thing is that when I did this project at the City of Mississauga, the one where we were really honing in on what are the essential duties of the position, what we had in the middle here was a PDA, CDA, but also this worksheet that they created. So that was their choice, is they wanted to create a new document called an Essential Duties Worksheet. And as much as it was meant to be this base document that was going to ultimately feed our job descriptions and our PDAs and our performance management plans, what they actually found was that by creating this document, it helped out in so many different aspects. And so, I mean, I think that you can really look at that, like, you look at whatever document you've now selected. This is going to be our standardized document, and think about how many different areas that it actually touches. So there can be a lot of bonuses when you're trying to think about how to sell any kind of a development like that. So it can really help to maximize your resources. It can be like coming up with that one document and doing it really, really well, or two documents, right? Maybe you're doing the job description and the PDA. It can be a really cost-effective way to build that groundwork, and then to help you comply with several sections within the AODA, build on your health and safety program, make sure that you really are in compliance with the Ontario Human Rights Code. It can just be like having that standardized document that clearly identifies your essential duties is going to be super beneficial. So I see a couple of questions have come in, so I'm just going to pause and take a look at them. Okay, so sorry, I'm just trying to read the questions here. Okay, so after you've completed the work plan and WSIB closed the file, then the worker brings in a note 6 months later requesting 10 to 12 weeks of modified, claiming the past WSIB issue. What recommendations would you make? Okay, let me think about this one after you completed the work plan. Okay, so this question that's coming in, I want to be able to answer it. I feel like I need a little bit more information. So for the person who has asked this question, I think I'm actually going to follow up with you directly just so that we can chat a little bit about that, because it sounds like it's something that's a little bit more specific, and just off the top of my head, I'm not quite sure how to answer that. The next question that's coming in is there recovery timelines for injuries like knee, back, and shoulders? And you know what, for that question, so is there recovery timelines for injuries? So for example, the knee, the back, the shoulders. The WSIB used to have some standardized medical precautions in place. I'm not positive if they are still using those. I know that I still kind of have a list of those, but when we're talking about soft tissue injuries, in general, there's some loose guidelines. I mean, if we were talking about those old standardized medical precautions for a shoulder injury, for example, there would be things like limit reaching above shoulder height and repetitive motion of the shoulder. Like, they're still very generic. And when we're talking about soft tissue injuries, usually it's a matter of weeks. Like, it's not usually more than 3 months. You should be able, if it's a soft tissue injury to the shoulder, to the wrist, to the elbow, and they're going through treatment, maybe they're seeing physio or a chiropractor, it should be something that is within a matter of weeks. Like, I'm thinking 8 to 12 weeks is kind of that standard number. But we can definitely, I can definitely follow up with you and talk about some specifics on that as well. Okay, so moving along. What I wanted to kind of summarize here is just what to take away from all of this. So when we're talking about doing accommodations in the workplace, I think ultimately what's kind of come of this webinar really is that I was really trying to focus on what are the essential duties of the job and how you would use those to do accommodations. And it kind of stems from being in compliance with the AODA. So I've summarized it in a couple of different questions that you can ask here. So what you might want to do is, if you haven't already, is maybe take a look at the employment standard. So look at the AODA, the Integrated Accessibility Standard Regulations, but specifically look at the employment standard, because that's the one that's going to ask about hiring, recruitment, return to work plans. That's where those elements come into place. So even just taking a look at that, and I mean, I would suggest you can look at the e-law system, and then but there's several guidelines that are available too, and I might look at some of those guidelines, the PDFs. They're easy to read. They really are. They've made several that are very user friendly, that really explain things to kind of help make it a little less cumbersome, right? There's a little less legal jargon. So I would start with looking at that if you haven't already, and then kind of doing a little checklist. Are you in compliance? So can you go through that employment standard, look at, I think there's about 13 different sections, and just say, yep, we're doing that, yep, we're doing that, or how are we doing that? It's kind of like doing a little bit of a gap analysis, so looking at what they say is required, and then kind of documenting what are you doing, and maybe that will help to identify where you've got some gaps, like maybe we should tweak this, maybe we should add this, or maybe you say, yep, we're good there. And then asking yourself the question is, what are the essential duties of our jobs? So do you know what they are? How are you documenting them? Again, it comes back to looking at the different documents that you do have in place and trying to choose which one or which 2, 3 are the ones that you're going to use, because ultimately you want to be able to confidently and efficiently answer that question if you were ever challenged. So again, if you needed to do an accommodation, if a candidate was applying for the job and asked if you could accommodate, again, if you had an employee who was requesting an accommodation, you want to be able to confidently and efficiently answer that question. So those are kind of the take-home tips that I'm trying to to push through to you from this webinar, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. And so what I'm thinking too is that if for any of you who attended our webinar last month, Alex presented on some ergonomic initiatives for 2016, and something that we offered in that webinar was actually to do a free PDA review. So we would take a look, you could send us the PDAs that you have in place, and we would take a look at them. And we got a great response from that actually, and I thought that it was actually very fitting for what I'm talking about today too. So it could even be what we would focus on this month is more focusing on those essential duties. So making sure that something that you've got in place, that it's actually going to work the way that you want it to. So from that Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, the AODA perspective, from that accommodation or return to work perspective, is your PDA documenting the essential duties of the job accurately, objectively, concisely? And so those are the things. If you're not really sure, or if you're not, you really just have no idea, that's the offer for this month as well. So kind of as a thank you for attending our webinar, and as always, we'll always answer all of your questions. You can email us, you can call us. And then this month in particular, if you are interested in having your PDA reviewed, that is something that I can do as well. And again, my focus would be from that essential duties perspective. So making sure that you've got the main duties of the job documented from an objective perspective. So I'm just going to check the question board here again. Okay, so what is the percentage of essential duties that an employee must be able to meet in order to accommodate permanently? For example, 1 out of 3, 2 out of 4. So what is the percentage of essential duties that employees must be able to meet? To be honest, I don't think that there is a specific number. I think that ends up being a bit of an internal case-by-case basis in terms of that. You need to be able to kind of go through some of those questions in the beginning. I mean, if there's only 3 tasks in the job and you're looking at, you probably want to put like a bit of a percentage weighting on each of those. So, I mean, ultimately, if a person can only do 10% of the job, that might be, like, I don't know what the specific number is, and if you use that same number for every accommodation perspective, but I mean, if you think about it, if somebody can only do 10% of the job, that would probably be good justification that for permanent accommodation. But I'm not sure necessarily that there is a specific number. You would need to look at how it actually affects some of your business operations as well, and how it would affect the rest of the staff. There'd be a lot of factors that you would need to consider, and I'm not sure that I could give you, and actually I don't think it actually exists, a specific number of tasks or a percentage of tasks that they have to be able to do to require permanent accommodation. Okay, and another question that's coming in, I'm going to read it out to you. I have an employee who has submitted a medical note requesting an accommodation plan, working on her restrictions and limitations out. Hang on, sorry. I have an employee who has submitted a medical note requesting an accommodation plan, working and her restrictions and limitations outweigh the PDA of her job, meaning that she is unable to do hardly any of the job duties. What is the next steps? Great question. So you have a PDA for the job, you've got a medical note, and what it sounds like then is that there's very few, what it sounds like from this question is that there are very few tasks that she's actually able to do. And if that's the case, it's kind of similar to the previous question actually, is that what you might want to do is take a look at whether or not she does stay in that job, in her pre-injury job, we could say, and you might want to look at some options of whether or not she can be accommodated to stay there. Is it something that tools or work method or work hours, could you change something like that or modify it to make it work? Or maybe it's a better option to look at whether or not she could be accommodated in a different position. So you might want, if that's the case, I don't know the nature of the jobs at your workplace, but if that's the case, then you might want to look at PDAs for other jobs, right, and see if it's just a physical thing, if maybe there's another job that's better suited to her. Okay, I think that's all the questions. So again, we've got a few minutes left in the webinar here, about 5 minutes. So if you have any questions, again, use that chat bar. If you think of questions after the fact or you'd rather just email or call me, that's fine as well. But I'll make sure to stay online here and just field any questions that do come in. Great, okay. So I don't see any popping up, but I've included my contact information as well. Don't forget that if you do have any questions or you want to review this webinar, I have been recording it. So assuming no glitches in the recording, this will be available for viewing afterwards, and I'll send out an email to everybody who's registered for the webinar to make sure that you get that recording as soon as the playback is available. Hopefully you've enjoyed the new webinar format, GoToWebinar. I know from a presenter perspective, I've in particular enjoyed it. I've liked it better than what we were using in the past. So hopefully it's been good from an attendee perspective as well. I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. Hopefully I answered some of your questions and your curiosities. And if you're looking at getting some more information on cognitive demands, hopefully you can join us next month. Our webinar will be on March 10th, and it's on cognitive demands assessments and really talking about how to make them objective. You know, with mental health issues being on the rise, you know, we're talking a lot about more publicly, we're talking a lot about more in the workplace, and having a cognitive demands assessment or some kind of objective documentation can actually help in that return to work process as well. So next month, Jennifer McGillis will be doing our webinar, and so you can get registered on our website, and hopefully we'll see you then. So I'm just gonna field back to the questions here. Okay, so kind of going back to that last question, what if they cannot be accommodated in another position, meaning the collective agreement doesn't allow it? Is the employer able to say that they cannot accommodate? In that case, to answer that question, I mean, I have some questions back to you as opposed to just saying yes or no. But now that you have a collective agreement and you've got that, you know, if you've got it documented, if you've got those physical demands documented and it is not a match for the employee and not a safe match for the employee as per what the employee has outlined that they can and cannot do and what the job is required, and you've got no match and the collective agreement has got some stipulations about how you can accommodate things, then possibly it is that you're saying that there's not a match. I would need to kind of talk to you a little bit about some of those specifics. Again, I don't know specifically what your collective agreement says, but again, if you've got a return to work process in place and you've got some policies, then hopefully you can fall back on what you've got documented to really help to justify your case. Okay, so I'm not seeing any other questions pop in. I see that some people are logging off. So again, I hope that you have a great day today. Thank you so much for joining in today. I will stay online for a few other minutes. And again, hopefully we will see you again next month. And don't forget that if you are interested in just kind of evaluating your PDAs, or even if you want to pick my brain a little bit about essential duties or return to work and accommodations, I'm happy to do that. That's always something that's complimentary by us, is that if you give me a call, send me an email, I'm happy to respond and talk about some of my experiences. So again, have a great day. We'll talk to you again soon.